Long before he had tasted his first UFC championship outing or reinvented himself as the polished fighter we saw competing against Chan Sung Jung, I had pegged Brian Ortega as one of the oddest fighters I had ever watched. Those two bouts aside, there was something very strange happening each and every time he set foot in the octagon. Putting his masterful submissions, his thunderous power, and his hulking size to one side, the most fearsome weapon in the arsenal of Brian Ortega is one that cannot be summed up through words and analysis alone. T-City brings to the table a killer instinct, an ace hidden up the sleeve, the ultimate intangible, a truly odd X-factor. I used to call it the Ortega factor during his original rise through the featherweight ranks. For me, that fighter who found his way into the cage with Max Holloway was a man defined by his uncoachable ability to find victory. There was never any tell, there was no foreshadow. Allow me to explain. He had this strange ability to find a win in bouts that he was almost always losing. Whether it was early distance that was being placed between him and his adversary, or an outright case of him clearly losing and pulling a finish out of the bag, Ortega had made his name on the back of his ability to completely subvert expectations. In his first 7 fights, he scored 7 finishes. Clay Guida was on his way to a decision victory over Ortega at UFC 199, outworking the rising contender in a performance that seemed to signal something of a return to form. Then, with 20 seconds remaining on the clock, Ortega found the perfect shot to dismantle him. It was finished with a knee that put Guida's lights out within seconds of what would have been a huge win for him. Prior to that, Ortega proved that killer instinct again by finishing Thiago Tavares in a similar fashion. But it was on that UFC 199 pay-per-view card that it became clear to me that Ortega had something special. Following this win, he would move on to Renato Moicano, in a bout that also showed him falling behind to a certain extent. Moicano was slick and composed on the feet that night, and to this day he gave T-City one of his toughest outings. But again, for what was a UFC record 4th third-round finish in a row, Ortega was able to snatch the win from the jaws of defeat, countering an admittedly ill-advised takedown attempt with a beautifully executed guillotine choke. 4 third-round finishes in a row. That's a record that may not ever be broken. A unique streak that is far too particular to be put down to luck. Ortega to me was a guy who just did never seem to pull ahead in fights. Even in his next outing against Cub Swanson, he was competitive but being outstruck by his veteran opponent. Of course, he again found the submission under shocking circumstances, jumping into a guillotine from the clinch before adjusting midair to really crank on it. Again, nothing too decisive had happened in this bout, save for a late round Darce choke attempt from T-City, but Swanson was pulling ahead on the feet, make no mistake. I don't present this as a consistent read on the expected outcomes of the bouts that made up Ortega's rise. Some of these matchups were in their earliest stages, and sure, anything could have happened. But as I watched, at the time, I could not help but notice this pattern. Brian Ortega never looked like a fighter who was about to win until he did. That might sound redundant, but trust me, there was something odd about this man's knack for pulling a win out of the bag. Once he stepped up and took on Frankie Edgar, it was a huge moment for him and his aspirations. Edgar was favoured, and rightly so, but after a confident opening few minutes from the answer, Ortega once again found his moment to spring. At this point, there was no doubt in my mind that we were looking at one of the most tuned-in finishers the sport had ever seen. There is a lot to be said for the one-punch power of a Francis Ngannou or an Anthony Johnson. Similarly, you can look at the mastery of someone like Khabib Nurmagomedov or Tony Ferguson, guys who break you down before the finish presents itself. Brian Ortega just doesn't fit into either of those boxes. He's creative, dynamic, and completely unpredictable due to the well-rounded nature of his offense. When I saw Max Holloway dismantle him over 5 rounds, I felt like it was something that I should have seen coming to some extent. Though his killer instincts were as clear as day, there was always going to be an expiration date on that approach. Too much of it was built on split-second openings, on quick thinking, on an awareness that just seemed too good to be true. Holloway was too much for Ortega at that time. His overall game just hadn't yet caught up to his most incredible asset as a fighter. And for me, I will admit that I lost hope to some extent, as far as evaluating Ortega as an elite fixture in that featherweight division was concerned. Then he went out there and he did what he did to the Korean zombie Chan Sung Jung. I've been a fan of both fighters for as long as they've both been in the highest levels of the sport, and I will tell you right now, that was an incredible performance from Brian Ortega. I've always spoken about his strengths with an asterisk in mind. In the vein of a Nick Diaz, Ortega's strengths are clear, but there are gaps between these strong points that were always going to make his progression difficult. The lack of a wrestling game, the defensive frailties, his overly relaxed demeanor in there. Ladies and gentlemen, I was invested in the Brian Ortega story as a consequence of the oddities that I noticed during his rise. But over 5 rounds in there with the Korean zombie, I saw something completely different. This was a more measured, more confident Brian Ortega. He was not content to play second fiddle to his opponent. He took the fight by the scruff of the neck and dominated its rhythm from start to finish. That was a different fighter we saw in there, and I have been forced to completely turn my expectations for his career on their head. He's still got that power, but it's now backed by a cleaner, more efficient level of technique. That over-reliance on his toughness seemed to be a thing of the past. We all know Chan Sung Jung is as game as any fighter who has ever fought in the sport, and yet, Ortega would not grant him a blood-soaked war. His grappling, which is likely his strongest area, as far as the overall MMA skill set is concerned, was now supported by improved wrestling. This seemed to me a man who used those 2 years off to take a very long look at himself. That requires a level of honesty that some fighters cannot stomach. And yet, if I had to bring 3 major criticisms of Ortega's style to the table, it appeared as though he had addressed all of them. That takes a lot more than some of you might think. So Ortega will move forth with this new approach, this more measured outlook on the sport, while retaining his grappling skills, his physicality, and one would assume, the X factor that set him apart to me in the first place. That's a terrifying proposition right there, folks. And while the time will no doubt come for me to stack him up against the champion Alexander Volkanovski, for now I just wanted to highlight what it was that I saw from Ortega on that night, because my confidence in him was tested, and given what I knew about his style, I was not overly sure that he could adapt and get around shortcomings that were so intrinsically linked to who he was as a fighter. I have no problem admitting that I completely underestimated this man. The featherweight division once again proves why it's among the finest in the sport. I suppose we'll just have to wait and see what is next for the champion Volkanovski, because the ball is well and truly in his court. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. And as always, thank you for watching.